Well, hello everyone. Sorry to have to do this remotely and not to have any more participation with other fellows as we're doing this. But I hope to have that in line next time for Wednesday evening's class. I'll be in touch with more details about that. At any rate, we're ready for lesson 19 from the book of Acts. This puts us in chapter number 21. And so if you're not there in chapter 21, please join me there. Just reminding you where we left off last time. We had, trying to get my PowerPoint to move on to here. All right, so we had started off with Paul back in chapter 18, leaving Antioch to begin his third missionary journey. He makes his way over here through Galatia and Phrygia, and then in chapter 19 we see him in Ephesus. He spends all of chapter 19 in Ephesus, after which he moves up here to Troas and then over here into Macedonia, comes down into Greece, and apparently stays in Corinth for a little while, and then he was going to sail straight from Corinth or Greece back to Syria or over to Jerusalem, but there was a plot of the Jews against him, and so he made his way back up this way, and that's where we left off last time. He makes his way through Macedonia, and let me just go ahead and zoom in a little bit. Makes his way. Let me back up. Actually, we're not quite there yet, are we? Makes his way from Macedonia down here to Troas. Of course, we remember that we talked about his time there in Troas with Eutychus and the church there. And then he makes his way down here to Miletus, and he talks to the Ephesian elders there. And that is where we left off last time at the end of chapter 20. So here he is in Miletus here in 20. Or as we close 20, and as we move into chapter 21, much of the first portion of this chapter is just his making his way from Asia over to Phoenicia and then into Judea. So he'll leave here from Miletus, and then he'll make his way. Luke records all of these stops down through here. Finally, makes it over here to Tyre. And there are Christians there, stays 7 days there in Tyre. I have to admit that Luke's language here, when he says that finding disciples, they stayed 7 days. I don't know if that means that they didn't know whether there were disciples there or not. Apparently, some translations have finding the disciples, and so that would lent to the idea that they knew that there were disciples there. They just had to look them up. And of course, in a port city like Tyre, it seems unlikely that there, number one, would not have been a church there, and number two, that if there were a church there, that Paul would have no idea that it was there. So in fact, secular history records that a church sprang up there shortly after the persecution that arose after the death of Stephen. So most likely, yes, they knew that there were disciples there. Yes, they knew there was a church there, and they just went to look them up so that they could stay with them for about a week. Well, after that, they make their way from Tyre down to Ptolemais, and then finally to Caesarea, where they stay for, it just says many days. We don't know exactly how long that they are there. And so arriving in Caesarea, Paul and his companions stay with this fellow, Philip the evangelist. And it turns out we've met this Philip before. It says in verse 8 that he is one of the seven. And so they stayed with him. And it'll say another verse or two down that they stayed many days there. So this is the same Philip who was among the seven that the church chose to see to the need of the Grecian or Hellenist widows who had been overlooked in the daily distribution. So we met him way back there. It's like we're reintroducing this cast of characters here, because we met Philip. We saw him not only as one of the seven, but then he goes into Samaria and preaches to the Samaritans, converts, among others, Simon the sorcerer, and then the Ethiopian eunuch. And then at the end of chapter 8 there, we last see him going toward Azotus, and then finally up here to Caesarea. And that's probably somewhere around 31, 32 AD. And so if this is 58 AD, pretty confident on that year. This is 58 AD. He's apparently been here in Caesarea for a good 25 years plus, all that time since the last time that we saw him. I have to admit, can't believe that this kind of thing has not occurred to me beforehand, or perhaps it has and I've forgotten about it. But Brother Michael Valenzuela shared some notes with me, and a note that he made about this. Here is Paul, the fellow who approved of Stephen's stoning. He is staying with a man who was one of Stephen's fellows, one of the seven there, one in fact who left Jerusalem in the wake of the persecution that arose after Stephen's death. And so there's certainly, you can imagine, would have been an opportunity for a chilly relationship between Paul and Philip, and yet apparently there is not. I think what we see here is we see a living example of Isaiah chapter 11 in the kingdom of the branch. The wolf will, this is verse 6 of Isaiah 11, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. So here we have these people who are not supposed to get along, and yet in Christ they can. In Christ they can find a way to reconcile. And obviously a change in Paul's behavior has allowed that to come about, but still you can imagine that there could be some harboring resentment, and yet Philip does not harbor that resentment, and Paul does not feel in any way unwelcome. They are now brethren, and they are reconciled to one another as well as being reconciled to God. Well, if you're reading along and you get to verse 4 here in chapter 21, it says that while they were in Tyre, and we're going to back up a little bit. We've actually passed Tyre by. We went from Tyre down to Caesarea, but backing up just a moment, just because we see the same message in Caesarea as well. In verse 4, while they were in Tyre, it says that the disciples told Paul through the Spirit not to go up to Jerusalem. And so that sounds, at least upon the first reading, it sounds as if the Spirit is not just warning Paul of what's going to happen, but rather he's saying, don't go up to Jerusalem. And then, of course, when they make it down to Caesarea, Agabus comes up from another cast of, or another fellow we've seen before, right? He had come up to Antioch back in chapter, what was it? Chapter 15, I guess, after the discussion about circumcision in Jerusalem. So he came up to Antioch. We've seen him before. We've seen him predict the famine. Well, actually that may have been back in chapter 11. Should have looked it up. Anyway, we've seen Agabus before. We have seen him make a prophecy before. Well, here he reappears and he meets Paul in Jerusalem in order to confirm the warnings that the Spirit has been giving him all along the way. Saying that he's gonna be bound. He uses his belt as an object lesson there. So Paul's been getting warnings. We could back up into chapter 20, where he says to the Ephesian elders that the Spirit has been telling me all along the way that I'm going to face bonds and persecution in Jerusalem. So the question is, was Paul somehow stubbornly determined to go to Jerusalem, even though the Spirit was saying you should not? Is that what's going on here? Well, in a word, no. So let's pull this apart a little bit. Number one, Paul, he was doing more than just going to Jerusalem to say hello or even to attend a feast. He's delivering the relief that he said that he was going to deliver to the saints in Judea. He had passed through Macedonia and Greece collecting it. And so now, as we look at Romans and we look at his plans, as he's writing from Corinth there and intending to make his way to Jerusalem. So he would have written it before where we are in the account right now, but only shortly before. He says, I'm going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints. This is Romans 15, beginning in verse 25. And then verse 26, for it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who were in Jerusalem. Of course, we can tie in 1 Corinthians 16 to this as well. So this is this is a duty or a job that Paul is executing here in delivering this relief to the saints in Judea. Well, number two, in the same breath that the Spirit was warning Paul of what awaited him in Jerusalem, he was also directing him to go to Jerusalem. Again, backing up into to Acts chapter 20, Paul says, and see, and this is again, Acts chapter 20, verse 22 is where we begin here. And see, now I go bound in the Spirit to Jerusalem, not knowing the things that will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies in every city, saying that chains and tribulations await me. So yes, the Spirit was warning him, but also this language seems to bear a resemblance to, for instance, the way Mark puts it when Jesus went into the wilderness after his baptism. Mark in chapter 1, verse 12 says that the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness. And so this business of being bound in the Spirit to Jerusalem seems as if though the Spirit is saying, yes, these bad things are going to happen to you, and yet this is where you need to go anyway. And Paul's not going to be dissuaded. So what I think we need to make out of this, where it says that that the disciples in Tyre told Paul through the Spirit not to go up to Jerusalem. It's not that they're saying the Spirit says not to go, but rather the Spirit is telling us the things that are going to happen to you, and so we don't want you to go up to Jerusalem. They are adding that bit of interpretation or their own preference there, not that Paul is disobeying a command here. Finally, it simply would not be in Paul's character to do this. I mean, we saw back, for instance, in chapter 16, where Paul wants to go into Asia to preach, and he wants to go into Bithynia in order to preach. But the Spirit says, no, don't go there. Don't go to those places. And Paul very willingly complies. He does not argue. He does not seem to defy what the Spirit says. See, we have very clearly a man who is obedient to the dictates of the Spirit. And so it would be very strange for him to all of a sudden just say, well, I don't care what the Spirit says. I'm going to Jerusalem anyway. So I think what we make out of this is that the Spirit is warning him of what's to come, but still saying, you still need to go. You still need to fulfill this mission, as it were. Well, Paul is determined. He's not going to be dissuaded. And I think it's interesting that that the people, the disciples who had been begging him not to go in Caesarea, they finally resigned, I guess is maybe one word we could use, but they finally came around and said, okay, verse 4, 21 verse 4, when he would not be persuaded, we ceased. So Luke even includes himself among that number who were saying, Paul, you don't need to go to Jerusalem. He says, no, we ceased, saying, the will of the Lord be done. We have seen a fondness of all the disciples. We saw a fondness and an appreciation and almost jealousy, wanting to hang on to Paul of the people in Troas. There in the early part of chapter 20, Paul doesn't go to Ephesus, but calls the Ephesian elders to himself in Miletus down in the latter part of chapter 20, and it's a tearful goodbye there. When he came to Tyre and they stayed there for that week, don't know what, I mean, we have no record that he has any real relationship with the people in Tyre, but they accompany him and his company out of the city when they go to leave. And then, of course, Paul says, what are you doing weeping and breaking my heart? And so everywhere Paul goes, the disciples, the Christians, appreciate him, and they don't want to see him go, and they don't want to see anything bad happen to him. And so this relationship, this instant fondness that people have with Paul wherever he goes, not to mention the places that he stays for a long period of time, is very touching. And at the same time, it's admirable that the disciples there in Caesarea say, okay, well, you know what? This is obviously the will of the Spirit, and so we need to accept this as well, and we need to let God's will be done in this case. So their fondness is very touching, but also their submission to the will of God is very admirable. Well, moving into question 4 here, Paul arrives in Jerusalem, and here it is again. It's this fondness. How did the brethren receive him? You can imagine, especially now that we've had this event that has happened. We don't know where to place it exactly, but sometime between the discussion that they had in Jerusalem about circumcision in Acts chapter 15 and now, or the writing of the book of Galatians, which we had a couple of chapters back, sometime in there, Peter had gone to Antioch while Paul was there, and Paul had to confront him about some mild hypocrisy on Peter's part there in Galatians chapter 2. Well, you've got that. You have the fact that Paul just isn't in Jerusalem a whole lot. You can imagine that the people in Jerusalem may not feel as if they have a very good or very close relationship with Paul, and yet, or you can imagine that perhaps, especially when he and Peter were at odds there a bit, you can imagine there might be a certain tenuous quality to the relationship there, but it just doesn't seem to be that way at all. When we look at last part of verse 17, when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And then verse 20, after Paul had told all of the things he'd been doing and all of the way he had been carrying the gospel to the Gentiles, verse 20, when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. So not only are they glad to see Paul, they're happy to hear about what he's been doing. There doesn't seem to be any bitterness or animosity or resentment that is between Paul and the Christians in Jerusalem at all. It's just a wonderful relationship. Well, let me go back up here to my PowerPoint file for just a minute. I asked the question, well, back in chapter 20, Paul said he was really trying to make Jerusalem in time for Pentecost. Did he make it? Well, Luke gives us some of the numbers. For instance, we know that well, let me back up just a minute. We know that they left Macedonia after the days of unleavened bread. That's chapter 20, verse 6. And you look back at Leviticus 23, there were 50 days between the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Harvest. 50 days from the end of one to the beginning of the other. So if they don't leave Macedonia until the Feast of Unleavened Bread is complete, they have at most 50 days to make it to Jerusalem by Pentecost. Well, Luke gives us some of those numbers. From Philippi to Troas, we've got 5 days. They stay a week in Troas, so that's another 7. As they go from Troas to Assos and Assos to Mytilene, Luke doesn't tell us how long that takes, but then he says there's another day for them to go from Mytilene to Chios, and then another day from Chios to Samos. From Samos to Miletus is 1 day, but then we don't know how long they're in Miletus. From Miletus to Kos, we don't know how long that takes, but from Kos to Rhodes, it takes 1 day. From Rhodes to Patara and Patara to Tyre, Luke doesn't tell us how long that takes. They stay a week in Tyre, but then from Tyre to Ptolemais, Luke doesn't tell us how long that takes. They're in Ptolemais for a day, and they go from Ptolemais to Caesarea, but Luke doesn't say how long that takes. He says that they stay many days. He says they stay many days in Caesarea with Philip, but then we don't know quite how long it takes to go from Caesarea to Jerusalem. At least Luke doesn't say how long they took to get there. So if I take all those numbers and add them up, just the ones that Luke gives us, that takes up fully half the time that they had, 24 days, 24 out of 50. Well, if we go through and we make some estimates, some of these we can probably be reasonably certain of. So from Troas to Assos, that seems to be a short sail from one to the other, and also Assos to Mytilene, that seems to be a short distance. So I've assigned just 1 day, just sort of guessing, 1 day to a lot of these. When they're in Miletus, we have that's the end of chapter 20, where Paul has called the Ephesian elders to himself to have a talk with them before he leaves. Maybe it was 3 days. They arrive, and then it's a day going up to Ephesus to fetch the elders, and then a day for them to come back, and then a day for Paul to talk. Don't know for certain, but if we just throw out 3 days as a possibility there. Maybe it was a day from Rhodes to Tyre. Maybe it was 3 days from Patara to, I'm sorry, not from Rhodes to Tyre, but Rhodes to Patara. From Patara to Tyre, that's sailing much of the Mediterranean Sea there, or a pretty good chunk of the Mediterranean Sea. So I said 3 days. I don't know, maybe a week's more realistic. I just don't know. But anyway, and then many days in Caesarea, I'm guessing many days is more than a week. And so we'll just say it's 10. Taking these estimates, I came up with 47 days. And that's assuming that, sailing from Patara to Tyre was not much longer. Is it possible that he made it? Yeah, maybe. Can we be absolutely certain? I don't know. No, we can't. Or rather, I should say, we can't be absolutely certain. But that just gives us some idea looking at the record that Luke has given us. If he, looking at well, let me back up. We talked about the fact that they stayed a week in Troas back in Acts chapter 20, and that seems to be significant. Seems as if he was staying in Troas in order to be able to meet with the church there on the first day of the week. Well, he takes another week in a couple places. He's a week in Tyre, so that means that either it took a week for them to board another ship, or perhaps he was hoping to meet with the church there as well. Once he gets to Caesarea, he spends many days, however many that is. And so maybe that means Paul has made good time up to that point. And so he can afford to take a little time and not to be in such a hurry. Peter goes from, what is it? I forgot to look it back up, but it's from one city. It's not Jerusalem, but it's another city that's pretty close, Joppa. It's from Joppa to Caesarea, and that seems to be a day's trip. So you can imagine that if that's a day's trip, Jerusalem is maybe 2 days. So maybe I should have said Caesarea to Joppa, but it was 2 days. But you can see how either he made really good time, and so he can afford to take a long time in Caesarea, or he'd already missed his deadline, and so what's the hurry anymore? We can take our time here in Caesarea. I just wanted to go through that because I think it's interesting. Luke gives us those numbers for a reason, and I think it's to help us at least to have some idea of what was going on there and whether Paul was able to make his deadline or not. Well, they get to Jerusalem, and James and the elders say, "Listen, here's what the Jews here, who are very zealous for the law, but they're also, I think in this case, we're talking about Jewish Christians." He says they're converts, but they're still zealous for the law. And they're hearing in verse 21 that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. Well, of course, Paul had done none of those things. Now, he has written Galatians and also Romans by this time. And in Galatians, he says, this is chapter 3, verses 24 and 25, he says that the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. Also, Romans chapter 7, verse 1, but I think this is actually verse 4. I think I've got that marked wrong. Anyway, the first few verses of chapter 7, he says, "Therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to God." So in both of these letters, Paul is saying you're no longer obligated to the law. But that's a very different thing from going around and teaching the Jews who live among the Gentiles who are now converting to Christianity. That's a very different thing from saying you need to stop abiding by those traditions and you need to stop circumcising your children. It's one thing to say you're not obligated. It's another thing to say you're prohibited from continuing to do this sort of thing. So Paul had not taught them that there is no place for them to be able to continue practicing circumcision or even some of the customs in the law. He just says you can't bind it on somebody else, but also you're not obligated to do it either. You're welcome to, but you're not obligated to. Well, nevertheless, this is the picture that the unbelieving Jews are painting of Paul, that he's going around and trying to undermine the scruples of the Jews who live among the Gentiles. Well, James and the elders, they have an idea. They say, listen, we've got 4 men. They've taken a vow. This is verses 23 and 24. You go with them, you be purified with them, pay their expenses so that they can shave their heads, and everybody will know that those things that they have been informed about concerning it, that they'll know that that's just rubbish. That they'll know that you walk orderly and that you keep the law as well. In other words, by undergoing purification and by paying these expenses, which appear to be in order to acquire the sacrifices that they would make as offerings, by doing those things, Paul is demonstrating that he has no objection to Jewish Christians continuing to keep the customs of the law, so long as they don't bind it, they don't obligate the Gentiles, and don't even obligate other Jews to do that sort of thing. Well, we had a vow mentioned back a couple of chapters ago when probably Paul, but maybe Aquila, shaved his head there or cut his hair in Cenchrea. Go ahead and get rid of my screen share here. There we go. So Paul or Aquila cut his hair, and we talked about that vow and said it's kind of hard to say exactly what that was. Probably not a Nazirite vow because of some of the details regarding the Nazirite vow. It would have been difficult for them to keep there. But what kind of a vow is this that these 4 men are keeping? Probably in this case, it is the Nazirite vow. We have the mention of the shaving of the heads in verse 24 and also making offerings in verse 26. So almost certainly the Nazirite vow that we find in Numbers 6. Now, I will say Paul's role in this, they say, listen, you need to be purified with them. So Paul's role in this is not altogether clear. He's certainly going to pay the expenses to acquire their sacrifices or the animals that would serve as their sacrifices. And apparently this was the kind of thing that that the Jews looked upon favorably. Johnny Stringer in his commentary cites, I think it's F.F. Bruce is who this guy is, a comment that he made that the Jews considered it a pious and charitable act to associate oneself with Nazirites in this manner, paying for their expenses when the time of their vow was up. So Paul's doing that, and this would be something that the Jews would find very upstanding. The kind of thing that a Jew's Jew would do, if I can put it that way. But the purification thing, well, some people read that Paul was purified with them or had to be purified with them, and they take it to mean that these men therefore were unclean. Because if you look at the vow of the Nazirite, if you completed the vow, and if you recall, you were supposed to stay away from the grape or any product from it, and you weren't supposed to make yourself unclean with a dead body. Well, if you did that, there were offerings that you made at the end of the term of your vow, in addition to shaving the head, but there was no cleansing or purification that you had to undergo. So what are we talking about here? Why is Paul having to be purified? Why are these men having to be purified? Well, perhaps what had happened is that they had come into contact with a dead body. And so if we look at Numbers 6, this is verses 9 through 12, if someone just drops dead near these fellows unaware, they didn't go looking for a dead body and handle the dead body, but it just happened out of nowhere, took them by surprise. Well, their vow was still spoiled. And they'd have to start over. But additionally, they had to undergo purification, and there were offerings that they had to offer once they completed that purification. So some people read this talking about this week of purification, and they conclude that these men must have somehow become unclean. I don't know that it's an absolute necessity. But even still, even if these men were unclean, why is Paul having to be purified? Well, this again almost certainly is not so much a thing that in the law, but rather a tradition of the Jews. I mean, Paul, to our knowledge, had not come into contact with a dead body. If he had, then you could make the case that he would need to be purified for a week before he went into the temple. But that doesn't seem to be the case. We have no record that he came into contact with a dead body. So the best we can come up with is that probably it was a Jewish tradition that if you had been in the contact or the company or perhaps away from Israel for some lengthy period of time, you needed to purify yourself before daring to come into the temple. So for whatever reason, Paul is, or I shouldn't say for whatever reason, whatever custom he was abiding by. He was doing so in order to say, guys, I'm not telling you, if you're a Jewish Christian, that you cannot abide by certain aspects of the law. In fact, I'm willing to do so myself. So he's doing that in order to clear his name, as it were, to make clear the way, in fact, he has been teaching and behaving. I'll point out one more thing, something that's never dawned on me. If these men had made a Nazirite vow, I mentioned already that they weren't supposed to partake of any product of the grape, fresh grapes or even grape juice, not simply wine, but even fresh grapes and grape juice. You're not allowed to partake of those. Well, if I'm a Nazirite and but I'm also a Christian, how do I partake of the Lord's Supper? And I really can only come up with two options. Either they did not partake of the fruit of the vine while they were observing the Nazirite vow, or they made an exception for the Lord's Supper. The Nazirite vow is it's unequivocal. You cannot you cannot consume the grape or any product of it. And so I'm not really comfortable with either one of these. But if this is a Nazirite vow, they had to do one or the other. And unfortunately, Luke does not give us all of those details. Well, as we move on, question number 9, upon what basis did the Jews from Asia conclude that Paul simply must have defiled the temple by bringing Gentiles into it? Well, they saw Trophimus, verse 29. They saw Trophimus, whom they recognized as an Ephesian, saw him with him in the city, and they just leapt to the conclusion that, well, he must have taken this man into the temple. And obviously, it simply does, logically, it does not follow. Just because I saw Paul in the city with the Gentile, it doesn't mean that he absolutely had to take him into the temple. It's just not logical. But this was a conclusion that they wanted to get Paul so badly. And so they leapt to that conclusion and had no qualms about doing so. Unfortunately, the Jews in the first century are not unique to that. We need to be careful that we check our biases and that we don't leap to a conclusion when we see some evidence that we think supports a conclusion that we'd really like to get to. Now, let's make sure that we step back, check our biases, check our emotions. Are we really evaluating the situation based on the evidence, not simply taking something that's good enough? That's good enough to assuage my conscience that, well, okay, I've looked at this or this looks guilty to me. No, we can't do that. We've got to be more intellectually honest than that. Well, that of course throws the city into an uproar. They grab hold of Paul. They apparently even begin to beat him. And so this fellow who's a commander of the Roman garrison there, he has to come in with soldiers and centurions, it says. They had dragged Paul out of the temple. They started to beat him. They were trying to kill him. And they only stop when they see the Roman guard coming along. Well, not only did he have to take Paul into custody, but it says, where is that? Verse 35, that even the soldiers had to carry Paul for a little while as they were trying to whisk him away from the crowd because they had become so violent, saying, away with this man. He ought not to live. I do think it's interesting. Did you notice there that in 21 verse 30, that when they dragged Paul out of the temple, they shut the doors? Lance just led us in the study of Malachi, chapter 1, verse 10. God is so fed up with the anemic, the insincere worship of the people in Malachi's day that he says, I just wish somebody would shut the doors. Wouldn't some of you just do that? Because I'm sick of your insincere offerings and worship. Well, isn't it ironic that the thing that finally got them to shut the doors was not a realization of their own sincerity, but a man who they assumed brought a Greek into the temple, this man who is an apostle of Jesus Christ, who had been sharing the gospel with Gentiles. We can't have this fellow in the temple. And so we're going to shut the doors at that. Sad commentary. I will say right quick, the Roman garrison here, just to get a lay of the land, Herod had built a tower that was attached to the temple complex here and had a stairway that spilled right out into the complex. And that's where this Roman garrison, or at least a portion of it, stayed. He called it the Tower of Antonia, named after his patron Mark Antony, and it provided a nice vantage point to be able to keep an eye on the crowds. And in case the natives ever got restless, as it were, via that stairway that spilled right out into the temple complex, the Romans could they could lickety split. They could be into the temple area, and they could quell any sort of violence or unrest, as in this case here with Paul, that broke out there in the temple area. Well, we have this, I'll never forget, the things that you remember. Never forget when I was going through Acts for the first time with Bruce Hall years ago now. We got to this point, and we read how that this fella, Paul speaks to the commander as the commander and his guards are whisking him away. They're going to take him and interrogate him, right? But Paul gets his attention and says, "Hey, listen, can I talk to you?" And apparently he's speaking Greek. And this seems to shock the fellow. And he says, "Wait a second, you can speak Greek? So you're not this Egyptian that led these assassins out into the wilderness?" And I just remember Bruce just laughing. It is kind of an absurd, or rather an absurd thing for somebody to conclude if you know the character of Paul. But of course, I think I think that this says something about what this fellow knew about the whole situation. He was completely in the dark. I mean, why in the world is the city all of a sudden in an uproar? What could this guy possibly have done? He must be some sort of notorious criminal or dissident or something like that. Well, there was, number one, in fact, there was an Egyptian who had deceived a bunch of folks and led them out into the wilderness. If Josephus is to be believed, rather, he writes there was an Egyptian false prophet who got together 30,000 men. Now there's some question. This fella, this commander said 4,000, and here Josephus is saying 30,000. Maybe the commander is only talking about a certain portion of that 30,000. Maybe Josephus was a bit exaggerating in his estimates there, but at any rate, so he says he got 30,000 men who were deluded by him. And he was ready to break into Jerusalem by force, conquer the Roman garrison. But Felix, so this is during the time that Felix is ruling there. Felix prevented his attempt. When it came to a battle, the Egyptian ran away, while the greatest part of those, the Egyptian ran away, while the greatest part of those that were with him were either destroyed or taken alive. So here you've seen this guy deceive a bunch of folks and lead them away and get a bunch of them killed. And so Johnny Stringer, he posits the idea that, well, maybe this commander sees this fellow being beaten and thinks, well, he must be this guy who got a bunch of his fellow countrymen killed, and so they're trying to bring him to justice. And it apparently was something that happened recent enough that this was on this fellow's mind. It made some sense that this it was in the realm of possibilities, I guess, that this guy could be this Egyptian who led a bunch of assassins out into the wilderness. At any rate, kind of funny for us, though, looking back. Assassins, Paul, come on, get real here. Well, finally, as we finish up here with question number 12, how does Paul convince him? Well, number one, he speaks Greek, and that gets his attention. Well, wait a second. And then he's able to explain who he is. Listen, I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia. I mean, we're not exactly small time over there in Tarsus. And that was enough. The fact that he was able to speak Greek and the fact that he was not foaming at the mouth or continuing to be belligerent, but rather he spoke very calm and reasoned. Would you let me speak to the crowd? And as we'll see as we move into the last verse of this chapter and then into the next chapter, we'll see that he agrees. And I can't help but be impressed with the way that here, I mean, these people are coming after Paul, coming after him for his life. And yet he says, I think there's an opportunity for me to speak to them and maybe get through to them. And of course, we'll see how that plays out here in the next chapter. Well, again, sorry to have to take the route of lecturing here and not having some participation. Hope to do that in the next class. We'll probably have 2 or 3 guys join me and we'll work our way through the questions. I'll have those out to you here probably maybe tomorrow morning, tomorrow evening at the latest, so that you can be prepared for Wednesday. And I'll post Wednesday's lesson once we're able to record it. But it'll either be Wednesday evening sometime, or perhaps Thursday morning before I'm able to get it posted. Anyway, thank you for your attention, and hope to see you all soon.